Welcome everybody to Four Freedoms. Today we're joined by the brilliant Joanne Payton. Welcome to the show, Joanne.
That's very kind of you to call me brilliant. I like that.
Thank you for coming on. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself to start off with, please.
Okay. Sadia's invited me on here because I did some research into honour-based violence. When I was still in school, I went to school in South Wales. It was really a fairly white school. I was kind of shocked by finding out about the sort of circumstances that some of the girls my age were living in. And I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. I was kind of fairly used to domestic violence within my milieu, within my family, within my community. But this kind of had a pattern that I didn't quite get, and it just sort of nagged at me. Mm. And then kind of over the years later on, I sort of still not understanding really how it operated. I volunteered with the Iranian and Kurdish women's rights organization. They're now called IKWRO, but at the time they were kind of one of the forerunners in bringing up the issue of honour-based violence in the UK. There were other organisations, but none of them really, it seemed to me, back in 2005, were attacking it with that same kind of enthusiasm. And I dropped them a line and I said, hi, I'm really interested in what you've been saying. And I recounted a couple of experiences from when I was young, from when I lived in Leeds, where I lived in quite in a part of Leeds where I could really observe some very weird dynamics that I couldn't get my head around. Mm. And I said, do you need any help? Because I noticed there was only 2 people on the staff then, and neither of them had English as a first language. There was a lot of help they could get with their website, just making it look a bit better. And the more I worked for them, the more I kind of started to feel like I was unpuzzling it. I created a website that was then called the International Campaign Against Honour Killings, very dramatic, very self-important. And I started recording in the media every thing that was reported as an honour killing. It was all in categories by country. I managed to get a few people in to do translations and stuff like that. It was I think at its time, it was fairly significant in getting the recognition that there were patterns that people weren't seeing. So you get the feeling that this was a time where, well, I can't say racism was an issue then, because racism is always an issue, but where the discourse around honour-based violence was very much enmeshed in how people were talking about race. So there was a lot of, it's exactly the same, so we shouldn't talk about it, or it's completely different and it's because they're savages, or, you know, a lot of negative stereotypes. And so it was a really hard thing to talk about it, and I felt that it was useful that there was this evidence. But at the same time, as I am collating all this evidence from countries all across the world, I started to sort of see the pattern. I sort of started to feel like this isn't just a weird thing that I don't understand that's been fascinating me. This is something that's beginning to make sense. So I started to sort of theorize it a bit. And then I started reading books, and finally I thought, I want to find out if I understand this like I think I do. And although I was then not a young person and I had 2 kids, I went and did a PhD at Cardiff University. I just kind of phoned up and I said to the lovely Dr. Amanda Robinson, I see you've done some work on honour-based violence. I've got a theory. I'd like to know how I would work that out. And she said, well, why don't you do a PhD? And I was like, excuse me, what? But she encouraged me and she helped me apply for funding. And that's how I got a PhD in my mid-40s, and wrote a thesis about honour killing in the Kurdistan region of Iraq.
Okay, so in terms of honour killings, what are honour killings and what is an honour crime? And you mentioned that you noticed some patterns. What were those patterns?
Some patterns. Well, first of all, as I said before, there was a kind of debate with, is this something which is just people being racist? Are they just saying that brown people, when they kill, that's honour killing and that's different? Is there something that's actually different in the way they're perpetrated and the way they're conceptualized? And I thought I need to investigate that before I even start, like, what is an honour killing? What is it about? So that's what I did. My first piece of research, which was before the PhD, it was a master's piece of research. where I went to IKWRO and I grabbed 20 files off the shelves. 10 of them had been marked by the caseworker as honour-based violence, and 10 of them had been marked as domestic violence. And I did like kind of a really close reading, set out a big table, put all the data in, and was like, is there a difference? What's the difference? And the differences that I kind of pulled out from how she'd categorized them were that the ones that were counted as honour crimes were collective. They involved more than one person. They involved agnation, which is a word meaning that it was by the male side of the family. It was not by her husband's family. It was her father's family. It was that part of the family. And the third, fairly obviously, is that people were going on about honour. They were saying there was rhetoric around the concept of honour. So, and what else came out from the files that I was looking at was that these crimes that differed on these three things, they were collective, they were agnatic, and they were motivated by honour, is that they were incredibly hard to work with. You could see that I kind of remember looking down afterwards, after I'd done the file, the research work, which was actually kind of quite distressing because these cases were really, really something quite awful, is that one side was like that and the other side was like that, because there had been so many more interventions. There was, you would be more likely that you would put a woman in a refuge and she would be found and you would have to move her. So the file would get thicker. And then, you would be having to apply all these sorts of extra measures.
So extra interventions that weren't needed in domestic abuse cases.
Yeah, I mean, if the difference is if it's a domestic violence case, you have one perpetrator and generally who mainly he is. So you've got an idea of what he might do, what his capacities are, and he's only one person in one big country. And even if he's got a couple of drinking buddies, they're not necessarily that committed to finding his ex-wife and giving her a kick. And then they're not invested to the same respect as we're looking at here. Whereas when we were looking at cases of honour crimes, we've got women who you can move her to Inverness, you can move her to John O'Groats. There are people who have their eyes out. There's a big community. There are cousins and second cousins, third cousins who will spot someone. There are kind of members of the community who will just be like, I don't recognize her and she looks like she is from my group, and they'll try and find out who she is, and in that way kind of bells will start jingling. I think a lot of people know about there are taxi drivers, and taxi drivers can be quite efficient communication networks. So the challenge is these people who don't necessarily think you don't necessarily think they're involved in the violence, but they feel like it's part of their duty to report back. They think it's the family's business what their girls are doing. So that's what made it a challenge. That's why the files were thick. And as I was concluding, really, that's why we need to establish the difference. We can't reject the fact there's a difference, because there are different measures we need to take. There are different precautions that need to be taken by agencies dealing with these kind of crimes.
Okay, so your new book, you talk about something called endogamy.
Endogamy, yeah.
Could you explain what that is?
And endogamy means kind of marriage within the family. There's kind of two sorts of marriage you can do. There's exogamy, where you marry someone who's outside your family, and endogamy, where you marry someone that's in. And here we've been exogamy is generally the rule in the sense of family. But of course, there's always expectations of people on who they marry. You might be expected to marry someone of your social class. You might be expected to marry someone of your general background. But endogamy means you have to marry within the family. There can be quite a lot of pressure about that. In my book, which is based on the PhD thesis, I was looking at various kind of forms of marriage. Because honour violence happens in quite a lot of places, and they're not really sort of contiguous culturally. There's a lot of cultures where honour-based violence happens. They don't have the same religion, they don't have the same language, they don't have the same general culture. So I was thinking, what can they have that might be connected with the honour-based violence that isn't any of these things, because it can't be. And so I started looking at forms of marriage. I would think that it would be quite an obvious place to start is forms of marriage with honour-based violence, because they're quite often around people who refuse forced marriages, about people who disrupt their marriages and occasion divorce, and are about how the expectations of what women have to do when they are married is violated. These can all kind of lead to honour-based violence. So I decided to do the research in Kurdistan based on looking at people from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And part of the reason for that was because for so very many long years I'd been working with the Iranian Kurdish women's rights organization. I felt a bit of understanding that would make it easier. But the other reason was because there was a very high level of honour-based violence, and it was quite well understood because there was also an extremely effective feminist movement in Kurdistan that was bringing all this out to our attention all the time. So it was quite a good level of research. And another reason was it wasn't kind of quite such a religious society as some of the others we were looking at. So it would be a little bit easier, I thought, maybe to tease out what was going on. So like I say, I was looking at marriage. So I got people to provide me data on their marriages and the marriages of their siblings, and then correlated it using statistics to see which kinds of marriage were implicated with a higher likelihood of honour-based violence, because I had a theory that, well, I had kind of several theories that every form of marriage could, in a way, have an impact on family honour within that environment, and I didn't know which one would be the strongest. But what did pop out of the data was endogamy, as in cousin marriages, were particularly problematic. That could be, I think, because I did an internet survey. I didn't really have a lot of money to go out to Iraq and do field work, and I didn't particularly want to, because this was at quite a dicey time I was doing the research, and I can't speak Arabic and I can't speak Kurdish, and I had small kids. So I did it through an internet research, which necessarily means that the people who are doing your research have computers and know how to use them. So it was a very self-selecting selection. So even if it didn't show that the other kinds of marriage were implicated, I thought might have been a lack of visibility of them. What did come out in this, let's say, fairly comparatively privileged collection was that if there was cousin marriage in your family, it was 2.5 times more likely that there would be honour-based violence in that same family. And that's kind of quite an interesting finding, because I don't think people have tried to do that before. They haven't tried to tie it back to family forms, and they certainly haven't produced a figure like that. I would like to see that done in other communities, to see if there were similar figures, if it was the same kind of thing. So I found this connection with the cousin marriage, and that was, I think, the most important statistical finding, and the one I think that should be most useful to people making policy and make people looking after cases, people doing risk assessments and such things as that.
Sure. So in terms of the UK, what communities are more likely to practice cousin marriages in the UK?
Well, I can't actually say in any sort of statistical way, but there is a purpose to cousin marriage. It's not sort of a thing. It's not just a thing that people do because they've always done it. It's quite often a way to keep property within a family, and the property is really what's important.
Isn't it also used to assist with residency claims, so bringing relatives to the country? Certainly, I know that's the case in my family.
I've heard of cases where residency issues are involved. I don't really know how that ties to honour-based violence particularly, but there is sort of a pressure where a family is organised by cousin marriage. It's quite often because they want to keep property within the hands of the family, so they're quite careful about where the women go, because they don't want that property to be dispersed. They don't want any challenges to their claim. They're kind of tying it all together. When you ask someone to marry their cousin, you are asking to keep this inheritance all in one lump. And that's very relevant if you have farmland. It's very relevant if you've got flocks of sheep and such things like that. It's different, obviously, in the modern scenario. Because most people are not now shepherds, and they're not now kind of subsistence farmers. But things are still quite often organised around family lines, particularly politics. You'll find sort of political power is going through families in states which, we'd call them neo-patrimonial, but quite often corrupt states will be organised via powerful families, and those powerful families will be controlling who's in their family and who's outside their family by enforcing some kind of endogamy.
So you kind of explained that it increases cousin marriages increase the likelihood of honor crimes and potentially honor killings as well. Do you know why that is the case? Why does it increase the likelihood of honor crimes?
Because the families that value cousin marriage are the kind of families that value honor, because they are the ones that they will tie their family reputation together through the cousin marriage, because it's important to them to keep that name. They tend to have more likely to have more of a tribal background, because you get a lot of tribal bodies are structured through cousin marriage.
Okay.
So there'll tend to be more tribal values there as well.
Yeah. So in your paper, you said that violence in cousin marriages occurs where women have no choice in relation to that marriage.
That's correct. Yeah.
So if they choose that cousin marriage, is there less likely to be violence in it then?
That's right. Yeah, I did the first sort of analysis had that figure that said there was the £2.5, and then I did a cross tabulation where I factored it against consent, and I made up a variable that kind of calculated how much consent was allowed in that family, and yeah, the risk is very dramatically increased if you're in a family which does not allow a lot of consent to marriage and has cousin marriage, because these two things combined present the most risk.
So, and what are the consequences? I think I can guess, but what are the consequences of refusing a cousin marriage?
One of the things about cousin marriage is that it's not necessarily in the parents' hands, it's in the hands of the wider family. So you can have cases where the father will be like, no, you don't have to marry your cousin, I don't like him, I don't like the look of him, I don't think he's good for you. But there'll be enough pressure put on him by his own brothers that he gives way, and that the cousin marriage continues. Another thing I found is that there is more likely to be cousin marriage and more likely to be coercion on elder children in the family than younger children. And that makes quite a lot of sense when you think about it, because if your brother is insisting that you make a connection with his branch of the family by putting a marriage in there, then you do it, the pressure's on you first, and the younger ones, they don't have to do that because that obligation's already been fulfilled. So there was quite a kind of marked first daughter effect, where the first daughter would be more likely to be cousin married, more likely to have experienced some kind of coercion.
I see.
These family ties are very important to the identity of the group. They're very important to the strength of the group and its self-perception, that the males of the group are connected, and they use women to connect the men of the group together.
I see. So we kind of already know the stigma that divorcees face within such communities. But are there any additional consequences that someone might face for divorcing out of a cousin marriage?
Yes, there's the difficulties of divorcing from a cousin marriage is it unknits that entire fabric of the family that's been built together through the intermarriage of cousins and cousins and cousins, and it can create severe ructions. It's quite an old book by a researcher who looked at Arabs in the Israel area called Gideon Kressel, but he found one couple refused to do a cousin marriage, and the fighting went on for months and months and months, and people were almost killed, because they were taking sides, because some were on one side, some with the other, and it potentially pulled the family apart. And that's a problem when you're in an environment where families are kind of competing. You need your family to be strong so that it can compete with the other families in the area. You don't need that kind of thing. So cousin marriages tend to be very solid. They don't have very high levels of divorce comparatively. You can see statistics that say they don't have the same levels of divorce. That doesn't necessarily mean, obviously, that people are happy. It means that it's very costly to the family for that divorce to be done.
That's quite a burden to bear, isn't it? That if you're going to, because there's this principle within, for example, my family, there are cousin marriages. There's also uncle and aunt marriages. Well, I was engaged to, I would call him uncle, the guy that I was engaged to. But that you're not just marrying that individual, you're marrying a family. It's a union of two families, and then the breakdown of that marriage is considered a breakdown of a family. You're tearing apart an entire family, even if that couple hasn't had children. It's quite a heavy burden to bear, isn't it?
It's a very heavy burden to bear.
So in
The
terms,
kind of other thing that's been said about cousin marriage and why it's related to honor-based violence, particularly within Muslim communities, is the fact or the problem that women inherit in Sharia law. Because if women are going around inheriting stuff, they are splitting up land and property and flocks that men think belong to them, and that is endangering the kind of survival of the male-centric version of the family.
I
So
don't know
the
if you,
reason that girls are married to their cousins is so that they don't do that. So they don't say, I want my inheritance, I want it now, I'm going to cash it in and go live somewhere else. It's to prevent them from doing that, to protect money, valuables.
I mean, I don't know if you came across this in your research, but this used to happen in Pakistan. I don't know if it still is. I wouldn't want to say, but there used to be a practice of getting your daughters married to the Quran so that you could retain family wealth. And once she was married to the Quran, her face wasn't allowed to be seen. She would then be considered a godly woman, but that basically kept the wealth of the family in the family. I don't know if you came across that in your research at all.
I didn't come across it in my research because I don't think that's a Kurdish thing at all. But I am aware of that as a way which actually can happen, as is naturally going to happen when there aren't enough male cousins. If there aren't enough male cousins to marry, then that's a solution that they've dreamt up to kind of circumvent the problem of women's inheritance. Small as it is compared to a man's, it's still problematic to men that we have anything at all.
Yeah, well, it's half of a man.
But that's quite an interesting theory, and it's not only applicable to the Muslim world, because it's also been found in some pockets of the Mediterranean where there was a similar arrangement where women inherited, in pockets of the Mediterranean, they were married to their cousins, and where women could not inherit, they were not. So that's an interesting thing, an interesting connection.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was another kind of marriage that you talked about in your research, which was exchange marriage, which I was particularly
exchange marriage, which is really pretty rare on a global scheme, but it's in Kurdistan it's called jin beijin, which means woman for woman. I think it happens in Pakistan as well, and it's called swara.
So we call it in Punjabi, it would be called vatta satta. So actually, it's not yeah, actually, it is woman for woman. You're right. So they would exchange the daughters in the families.
Yeah.
So in terms of the Pakistani context, it's essentially about maintaining control. So if one marriage there's any issues going on, it would impact the other marriage. So
That's
it's about
right.
maintaining control. I don't know if you found the same thing in
I
the Kurdish
think
context.
it's the same motivation, not necessarily in all, but in the ones in Kurdistan and in Afghanistan, which I brought in as a comparison. It's called Burdal in Afghanistan. Um, that it's a way, well, firstly to sort of circumvent bride price, but also to sort of guarantee the connections between the families by doubling them up. And it is, again, problematic because you are kind of underscoring one relationship with the other one. So if one couple breaks up, the other one are bound to do so as well.
Mm,
And that can be very hard because one couple can be quite happy with each other, but they are forced to break up. I found that that was really quite interesting the way the ceremonies. I did not actually find anything in the literature to talk about Iraq, but in Turkey, they'll walk across a bridge and cross at the same point, like spies in one of those smiley novels. Um, and there's a huge amount of care taken. I don't know if this is the same where you're talking about, to make sure that the exchange looks absolutely equivalent. Like all the wedding gifts will kind of be weighed. We are giving her a bracelet that weighs this much. She must have a bracelet that weighs this much. It's kind of very painstaking to show that this is an equal, balanced
mm,
relationship. And what kind of concerned me here is how do you balance two women? You can weigh two bracelets, you cannot weigh two women. But what you can do is kind of try and enforce a moral code that sort of standardizes their marriageability, that how much they will conform um,
mm,
to the standards expected of them in the community.
mm,
It tends to happen that within small, quite insular communities that they'll organize themselves like this. In some places, you'll find it's almost the rule, but most it's quite rare. But there are some sort of little villages where it's really very, very predominant.
mm. I
There's
mean, there
another
is.
issue that's Jinbei is just woman for woman, and as I've described it, we're talking about people the same age, but there's another version called Gara Bechuk, which you exchange a couple of girls for an adult woman, um, which can be done by sort of your more unscrupulous man to get himself a second wife and get rid of a couple of hungry daughters. This is all quite rare, and it's probably quite old-fashioned now. But I'm very interested here in the patterns of what's going on. The women are being exchanged. It's obviously not very good
Mm.
experience for these young girls.
So where is that practice of exchanging to younger girls for? Where did you find that
Oh,
for an
that
older
was
woman?
in the Kurdish situation. It's historic, I think, now, but it's not sort of super duper hundreds of years ago historic.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Um, so in terms of coming back to cousin marriages, um, what does British law say about cousin marriages?
In a lot of the Christian Europe, cousin marriages have been classed as incestuous for a long time, and there was
Mm,
political reasons why that was brought in. Um, the church decided a lot of marriages, which hitherto had been practiced quite freely in Europe, would be counted as incestuous under Christianity quite a long time ago, and it really kind of shook up the whole structure of the family, especially in the Mediterranean, where this was more common.
mm,
Um, a lot I don't think maybe you'd be too surprised to see that the Mediterranean also has quite a flourishing honor culture, um, and has up until fairly recently. You can find kind of accounts of honor crimes in Italy, right up to um, well, only about 20 years ago. And honor killings were kind of semi-legal in Italy until the year I was born. This is part of the discussion of cousin marriage. There's kind of a shared culture around the Mediterranean and North Africa and the kind of Maghreb area, where you would find similar patterns like that.
So are you talking about minority communities within
No.
Italy or the actual?
No. Um, I'm talking about Southern Europe, like
Okay.
particularly about Greece and Italy and Southern France and this kind of region. You would find quite a lot of honor-based violence there as well. N Not as recently, but recently enough, if you know what I mean. And I I can't kind of quite remember the names, but I've picked up a couple of kind of native Italians with similar sort of behaviors like that. If you read, I think A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, quite a classic American novel. There's an honor killing in there in a Sicilian family in America in the 1940s, I think it's that. Um, if that's kind of finding out all this stuff is part of the reason that I wanted to kind of not look at religion, not look at culture, instead look at material issues about what benefits the family are getting, why would they do it. This is really the problem that made me think, why would people commit honor killing? It costs them so much and it brings them so little,
Mm,
because they don't necessarily do it out of hate. They can do it it can be a very painful thing that they feel that they have to do for the sake of their honor. And it doesn't really, what does it do? What does it do? That's what I needed to understand.
mm. And what does it do?
What it does is it clears your face, as they say in Kurdish. They say if you are dishonored, you have a black face, and if you clean it, you can show yourself in public. You get readmitted into the community. You get readmitted into society. You get pushed out, and you get pulled back in again. And that's why we find kind of quite a lot of double standards about what honor is. I think this was one of the things that sort of tipped my thinking, is noticing that it doesn't really matter what a girl actually does, as long as she gets away with it, if you know
Mm,
what I mean.
mm,
Some families might take it very personally and they've internalized the code, but for others, it's, was she seen? Do people know? And that's still the case in Kurdistan. Certainly, there's the women's activists say we can save her if nobody knows. If you can get a quick abortion on the side, if the boyfriend will shut up about it and not go around bragging,
mm.
you can do all sorts of things if people don't find out. And the flip side of that is, if people talk about you and people believe it, you don't actually have to be guilty. It doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference to you. It doesn't make any difference to your family. They're still under the same kind of pressure from the community. They're still excluded from the community until they do something.
What's interesting from my perspective is the difference in terms of what we see here in the British context and in the communities and countries that do practice honour killings and honour crimes. The role of, firstly, the role of the mother, of either being that
As
believing
complicit.
as complicit with the perpetrators, or as the kind of weak, vulnerable victim within the context. And both, for me, piss me off, if I'm honest, because on the one hand, I can't wrap my head around, and I've experienced these things. I can't wrap my head around the mother that colludes. When we hear about these mothers that are supposed to be tigresses when their children are at risk, but on the other hand as well, the mother that is the weak, vulnerable, meek victim in the scenario, I still can't understand at the point when that her children are at risk, her daughters are at risk, why that victim doesn't then become emboldened to safeguard her children. So what is going on that front? What has your research showed you on that front?
Well, I couldn't specifically do research into female perpetrators, but I did kind of read quite a few cases. And there was one, I think, that I was particularly horrifying case was, some tribal Kurds were kind of living in what was basically a refugee camp. And one of the young women was raped, but there were no men. So her mother said she had to take the responsibility to kill her herself. And the interview with the woman shows she was very, very torn, very shaken up about it. But I think what came through is that she felt she had to do it for her other children. That it was a sacrifice, it was a very painful sacrifice that she kind of completely obsessed her, presumably for the rest of her life, but that she knew her other children could not have any kind of life unless she did something, because she couldn't take them out of the refugee camp. And she needed to get them married off. And that's, I think, the key of trying to understand where it is not to look necessarily at the individual, but at the choices fostered onto the individual by their community and the circumstances in which they have to make those choices. So if she was in a city, maybe she could have been like, screw you guys, I'm just going to move. But she was in a refugee camp and she couldn't. And she could have got the girl married off if she could have not have everyone not know about the rape, but they all did. So she felt she was backed into a corner.
I mean, I've heard this sort of stuff before, and I find it really difficult to process because I've heard these justifications that I had to do it for the rest of the children, or that I've heard the kind of justification, my other kids wouldn't get married, my other kids wouldn't have any future if I didn't give up this one child. Do you know what? You could have told her to run away. I will tell everybody I killed you and disposed of the body. Leave right now. The thing is that there's no creativity on the parts of these mothers, and sometimes even the fathers. When the fathers kill, it's a lot more violent. But when the mothers kill, afterwards we're very, very careful about how we talk about them. Well, they were also a victim of their circumstances. I personally find it much, much harder when I hear about mothers killing, because I can't help but question, where did your maternal instinct go? Where was that switch in your brain that went, okay, I know I've got to think about the other kids, but I'll do whatever I can to also protect this child? I find that very, very difficult, if I'm honest.
It's very disturbing to think, actually, that what being a mother means can be like that can make you think that kind of trade-off is acceptable.
Another example that I heard like this that made me quite cross, actually, was it was when the partition was happening in India, and some Sikh men said to their women, and this is about the male honor, right?
Yeah.
The Muslims are coming, they're going to rape you, right? So rather than watch you be raped and then support you afterwards, we'll kill you. And what they did was stand these women on a well, decapitate them, and push them into the well. And for me, I couldn't understand why. You knew these men were coming. You had swords. You didn't hand these women swords and say, you fight. And if you get raped, we will be standing right beside you. Rape has been used as a weapon of war since the beginning of time.
I think it's probably the first weapon of war.
Precisely, right? So rather than have a woman who had been raped and dishonored in their language, they would rather kill them with their own hands. I can't understand that. So there's these complex issues when it comes to honor crimes, and we're very good at
a bit. Andrea Dworkin writes about that same kind of thing, but I think she either takes it from the Bible or she takes it from kind of Jewish history, where there's the same thing, where there's a massacre of women to prevent them from being raped. It's just the epitome of women as property, isn't it? It's like setting your house on fire so no one else can live there. It's
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 exactly
horrendous.
that principle. It's exactly that principle because we see that with uh, men that hold these like honor related ideas. They are quite happy to trespass on and use and abuse other women. However, if their women are used or choose to have any kind of relationships outside of the approved group, they will burn their house down. They will murder these women because then they are spoiled goods. These ideas are so outdated, and I don't think I would pussyfoot around them quite as delicately anymore, really, because they are outdated. And I realize when it comes to challenging these ideas, people feel like because it's a different culture or a different community
Yeah.
that we need to be respectful. And quite frankly, I don't understand that anymore because certain ideas are universal, right? Of liberty, right to life,
Mhm.
of choice, and I don't think that there's any need to accommodate for somebody's outdated ideas now, because even in the countries where these practices might be happening, there's also this huge movement underneath uh, of people challenging those ideas,
Mhm.
and women challenging those ideas in particular end up being raped, imprisoned, tortured, etc. So these ideas aren't normal anymore in
No, they're
those.
not normal anymore, but they are found in certain situations.
Mm,
You know that they're not maybe found in the urban centres where people are demonstrating. I don't know if you're aware, but there's been massive demonstrations against honor killing in Jordan over the past couple weeks. It's quite a shocking case. Um, the young woman was killed by her father, and he sat drinking a cup of tea, waiting for the police to turn up because he was so kind of sure of himself. Um, but somebody recorded it on a mobile phone, and the sounds of this woman screaming went all across Jordanian social media, and there's been huge demonstrations. Um, because Jordan was actually had an extremely strong women's organization. They were one of the first to get rules on the books. They've recently got a shelter open, which is specifically for potential victims of honor-based violence. For years before that, they were actually put women in prison for their own protection, indefinitely. Um, but now they have a refuge and they're trying to be much more progressive. But there are still people doing it, and there are still people in the comments going, "He did nothing wrong. She shouldn't have been seeing a guy."
mm, mm. Um, so in your view, um, should now we know that there's this other link also with cousin marriages. We also know from quite extensive research now that cousin marriages can result in birth defects.
Yeah,
Um,
repeated cousin marriage over generation after generation. Well, yes.
so actually, you're right in one thing. Um, where there is cousin marriages, the likelihood is that it's going to happen for generations, isn't there? There's a kind of culture of cousin marriages because it's been normalized. So, and that is guaranteed going to lead to birth defects as well. So that is one component. Then this new component that you've found of the increased likelihood of honor crimes.
Yeah, the,
And
the causality is probably not that way. It's that families that tend to have honor crimes are more likely to force cousin marriage rather than the cousin marriage creates it.
mm, there's also the component of there's more likely to be like more family involvement if you're involved in a cousin marriage, right? So knowing all of these things, do you think
Actually, the
that?
more family involvement, the higher the risk of honor-based violence also. That's a correlation that I found. Because I also asked people if they had arranged marriages, how many people were involved in arranging their marriage, and did kind of a statistical correlation. And the more people involved in arranging the marriage, the higher the risk in that
Yeah.
family, because more people are tied in.
Mm.
More people make it their business to police the marriage. More people are invested in making sure it succeeds, which means more people are violently punitive if it doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think then that Britain should be outlawing cousin marriages?
Well, I don't know. I think from a genetic perspective, you would definitely need to give people counselling and maybe advise testing.
Mm.
Um, do not Ashkenazi Jews have testing before marriage because they're aware of the likelihood of passing on genetic diseases. But I think from a protection of vulnerable people thing, we should be looking at cousin marriage as maybe not a red flag, but a pink one. That this family needs to be watched, particularly if there are repeated cousin marriages and stuff like that. We shouldn't kind of just be like, yeah, that's what they do. We should be, that's what they do, but let's also keep an eye. And let's establish how consensual this cousin marriage was. And that's
Mm.
not just a matter of, did you say yes? That's a matter of seeing whether the environment is one in which someone can object reasonably. Is that person old enough? Are they able to make that decision? These are sort of things we should be flagging when we're looking at cousin marriage. It's something that we should be wary of, I think.
Mm. Mm. Um, so do you have any final comments?
I think what I'd like people to take from this is maybe not to sort of specifically look at the work I've done, but look something a little bit bigger and start thinking critically about the family as it is, and start thinking about how the patterns of how families work, how they impact us. Um, why do we have one form of a family and not another? Why is it that some forms of the family are preferred over others? Um, and can we sort of tease out what it means, particularly to have families which are kind of dominated by men, where men hold control over it? What does that mean for women to be in families where men just have more structural power, where they have kind of closer alignment with their male relatives than you have with them, and that kind of thing? We have to be careful about family structures because they are paradigms that can create and replicate male violence.
Mm. And if people want to follow you or find you, where can they find you?
Um, my name is Joanne Payton, Payton, and I've got a blog where you can, if you want, get I think 20 or 30% off my book, Honour and the Political Economy of Marriage, which was published by Rutgers University Press. Now I can tag them in when we tweet this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Jo. Thank
It's
you.
great speaking to you. Let's